In 2023, in a quiet dockside community in Canada, a 52-year-old man lived through a medical event so rare and so alarming that it would later be published in one of the world's leading respiratory medical journals, Chest Journal. He wasn't a celebrity, nor was he doing anything particularly dangerous at the time. In fact, what nearly killed him was something most people would completely overlook. A small, forgettable memento bit of water inhaled during his work at the docks was all it took to push his body toward a silent and delayed disaster. What happened over the next 72 hours would shock even seasoned physicians. And if it weren't for the most unexpected piece of technologies, Apple Watch, the story might have ended in a fatal mystery. The man worked as a dock worker, handling cargo and maintenance by the water. At some point during his routine shift, he had a minor encounter with saltwater, just a small splash, not even enough to trigger concern. There was no drowning, no panic, no trip to the hospital. He didn't even think to mention it to anyone. It was so minor that he likely forgot about it altogether. But what he didn't realize was that during that brief moment, some salt water had entered his lung. Not enough to choke him, not enough to make him cough, but just enough to spark a slow, invisible reaction inside his body. For the next 3 days, he carried on as usual. He went home, ate dinner, maybe watched television, and went to bed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But something dangerous was growing inside him, something his body wasn't warning him about until it was almost too late. Then, 72 hours later, while he was sleeping in his bed, it struck. Without warning, his lungs began to fill with fluid. He wasn't underwater. He wasn't even near the ocean anymore. Yet his body was reacting as if he were drowning. The sensation must have been terrifying, waking up in the middle of the night, unable to breathe properly, lungs tightening, every breath feeling shallower than the last. But in the haze of sleep and panic, something else was happening quietly. On his wrist, his Apple Watch, programmed to track his vitals, detected that his oxygen saturation had plummeted to 62%. For context, a normal blood oxygen level ranges between 95% and 100%. A reading of 62% is critical, life-threatening, and while he may not have immediately known what was happening, the device did. Whether through an alert to his phone or another linked device, the data from his smartwatch became the first true signal that something was very, very wrong. He was rushed to the hospital. By the time doctors evaluated him, his condition was deteriorating rapidly. He was diagnosed with a condition called delayed pulmonary edema, rare and often misunderstood medical event that can occur after the aspiration of salt water. Essentially, fluid begins to build up in the lungs over time, hours or even days after the initial inhalation. It's what's sometimes called secondary drowning. You might seem completely fine at first walking, talking, even sleeping, only for your lungs to fail you days later. In most cases, the onset is so quiet that victims don't realize they're in danger until it's too late. Had he not been wearing a device that tracked his blood oxygen levels in real time, this man might have died in his sleep, with no one knowing what caused it. Doctors treated him aggressively, removing the fluid and stabilizing his oxygen levels. He survived the ordeal, but the experience changed him. Not only had he come terrifyingly close to death from something so seemingly trivial, but the only reason he was still alive was because of a piece of consumer technology on his wrist. It wasn't a dramatic CPR moment. It wasn't a lifeguard diving in to save him. It was quiet. It was invisible. And it was his smartwatch that gave him the time he needed to stay alive. After his recovery, the man chose to speak out. He began advocating for the use of post-swim and post-incident monitoring, especially after any kind of exposure to salt water, no matter how minor. To many, it sounded like overkill. Why worry about a splash to the face or a mouthful of seawater? But to him, it was a matter of life and death. He became a vocal supporter of wearable tech and health tracking, believing that these devices should be seen not just as fitness tools, but as literal lifesavers. His experience also sparked new conversations in the medical community about how secondary drowning is understood, diagnosed, and most importantly, how it's prevented. His story may not have involved sirens blaring or helicopters in the sky, but it stands as one of the most quietly terrifying cases of the year. It forces us to ask, how many people suffer from delayed pulmonary complications without ever making the connection to that one moment days earlier? How many people never get the warning? And how many lives could be saved if more people understood the silent dangers of secondary drowning? In a world where technology is often criticized for being invasive, distracting, or addictive, this case offered a different perspective. For one man in Canada, his Apple Watch wasn't just a gadget. It wasn't about tracking steps or calories. It was about staying alive. It was about being alerted when his own body couldn't tell him he was dying. This isn't a cautionary tale about dangerous waters or even about faulty judgment. It's a story about the body's silence, the unpredictability of rare medical conditions, and how modern technology, when used right, can become the voice that warns you when your own body won't. And that is the story of the man who drowned while lying in bed on dry land.